defamation law in Republika Srpska, it has been criminalized. Do you think that states should go in that direction to criminalize such things as defamation? Or do you think that maybe it's actually a tool of the strong men in the various states to battle journalists and free thinkers and criticizers of their government?
The criminalization of defamation laws has been widely criticized by international NGOs, CSOs, as well as different bodies of the UN, and press freedom organizations, of course. And yet it's a trend across Europe. I think 15 or so governments in Central and Eastern Europe criminalize defamation, as well as governments in Western Europe, such as Italy's. In Lebanon, we've seen the security agencies use criminal defamation laws to go after hundreds of people, forcing them to sign documents saying that they will no longer criticize the government for corruption. So these laws are really dangerous wherever they're used, and when Western governments implement them, they set a poor example for other governments around the world.
Defamation is criminalized in Republika Srpska, and there is, I think, 50 cases now where journalists or NGO activists need to appear in front of court because of this. What do you think that the best effort in battling this is?
I think that international collaboration to oppose criminal defamation is really important. As I said, we see criminal defamation laws throughout the EU, in I think 14 or so states in the United States, and around the rest of the world. And yet these laws have all been widely criticized by international groups, press freedom groups, and bodies of the UN. So I think that it's really important to look to international human rights frameworks. Of course, at the same time, that doesn't always work in every case, in every state. So I think it's also important to fight these at the local level as well.
How do you battle the argument that having law against the negation of genocide is actually a law against freedom of speech? That's the first question. The second question would be, what do you think that Bosnia and Herzegovina can learn from Germany, having in mind that Bosnia's law is not being implemented in the way that people imagine it to be?
Yeah, so laws against denial of genocide are of course allowed under international human rights frameworks, and yet at the same time they can of course be politicized. We often see them used against individuals who don't have much power while they're not used against state actors. And so that's an obvious problem to these laws. At the same time, in states like Bosnia and in Germany, it's understandable that these would be implemented by governments and by legislation. And so, I think it's really important to counter this at a social level and to look maybe at civil penalties rather than criminal ones for such acts. I think that the social cost for genocide denial, for hate speech, should be high, and frankly, that's how I would like to see these things dealt with within societies, that people should not necessarily be able to maintain, a public-facing job or, a government office if they engage in such practices. But at the same time, I think that what we've seen in the United States is often that people who do engage in hate speech are able to move up the ranks, and that's a risk in any government, in any country rather, that's turning towards the right. When we look at Germany, it was only 2 years ago that the law was changed to include the denial of other genocides other than the Holocaust. And yet now, as I mentioned, what we see in ongoing practice is widespread denial of what's happening in Palestine, whether as a war crime or genocide or incitement to genocide. And that's, sort of acceptable within society as well, not just under the law. And so I think that, this does to me represent a rightward trend, or a trend in which governments are able to politicize what is and is not genocide. And I think that that's the risk that we face with this, in a rightward trend, we'll see that certain things become acceptable and other things are not, and that's where these criminal penalties can fall on the ordinary citizen while not affecting those who are engaged in government.
I mentioned that freedom of speech is being redefined. Russia does it most of the time when talking about freedom of speech in Europe, saying that in Europe freedom of speech is non-existent or it's one-sided, and that actually the Russian media and the Russian way of thinking about certain politics in Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine, is actually an example of freedom of speech. Why do you think that Moscow needs this kind of narrative?
I think that in the Russian case, I mean, what we see this in other cases as well, where going against the EU and pointing out the flaws in the EU helps them avoid criticism of their own practices. And yet, at the same time, within the EU, freedom of expression is not ideal. The EU does have a lot of things to make up for, a lot of changes to make before it can set a strong example. But at the same time, of course, Russia is using this in a political way.
How do you explain the absurdity of the situation where authorities in Bosnia and Herzegovina look up to the practices of Hungary, of Russian Federation, and at the same time there is a political shift in the United States where Elon Musk, with his political affiliations, has created a platform in which he decides what is the freedom of speech.
What we're seeing is sort of a global trend, a turn toward authoritarian or strongman figures, and this idea of defining free speech in a way that sort of replicates American ideas about freedom of expression, but in a way where restrictions are actually placed and are politicized on certain types of speech. When it comes to X or Twitter, for example, we do see instances where Elon Musk has removed users who criticize his business practices while he continues to say that free speech is paramount on the platform, even though it is not.
Do we need to be concerned about the trend that the Western world, or the world in general, is heading, having in mind the freedom of speech, and how do countries like Russian Federation or Elon Musk think about the freedom of speech?
I think globally we need to be concerned about the direction that freedom of expression is headed. We've seen a lot of criticism from top levels of the UN, for instance, about the ways that different laws around the world are changing. At the same time, we're seeing the abuse of certain laws to prosecute critics of governments. And when it comes to the online world and social media in particular, the centralization of these platforms and the way that their policies are created, often in hand with governments, is really concerning.